The station was never quiet, conclave. Station Vera 9 floated in the middle of deep space like a small metal city. It had 17 docking rings, 412 commercial bays, and enough food courts to feed a small planet. Ships came and went every few minutes. Creatures of all shapes and sizes moved through its wide corridors at all hours. Some had 4 legs, some had none, some breathed gases that would kill a human. In 30 seconds, the station had special chambers for those ones. It was, by every measure, the busiest and most important transit station in the known galaxy. Diplomats traveled through it, merchants moved goods across its loading docks. Scientists passed through on their way to distant research posts. Every species that had ever signed the conclave charter had people on the station at any given moment. Nobody paid much attention to anyone else. That was the nature of a place like Vera 9. Everyone had somewhere to be. The human walked in through gate 11 at the start of the 3rd shift. His name was Calder Rin. He was 51 years old, average height, with gray starting to take over the dark hair at his temples. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from stone and eyes that were a pale, tired sort of blue. He wore plain civilian clothes, dark trousers, a worn jacket that had seen better years, and boots that had clearly walked a very long way in a very long life. He carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and held a battered metal thermos in his right hand. He looked in every possible way like a man who simply wanted to get from one place to another without any trouble. Vora was working gate 11 that shift. She was a Thesic, tall, thin, with 4 arms and a narrow face that ended in a pair of small sensory tendrils just above her upper lip. She had been working the gate for 11 years. In that time she had processed passengers from over 600 different species. She was very good at her job. She was also, by this point in her career, almost impossible to surprise. She held out one of her lower hands toward the human without looking up from her secondary screen. "Biosample, please." The human placed his thumb on the small reader she extended toward him. It pricked the skin gently, drew a single microscopic drop of blood, and passed the sample to the station's main genetic registry scanner. Standard procedure. The whole process normally took less than a second. The scanner would read the DNA, match it to a known species profile in the galactic registry, confirm the passenger's identity, and issue a clearance code. Vora waited. She glanced at her screen. The scanner was still running. She looked at the progress bar. It was turning slowly, which never happened. The system was one of the most powerful biological analysis machines ever built. It had processed over 11 million known species profiles. It did not turn. Slowly, she tapped the screen lightly, thinking it might be a display error. It was not a display error. The scanner kept running. 5 seconds. 10, 20. Calder Rin stood on the other side of the gate counter, thermos raised to his lips, waiting patiently. He looked at Vora. She looked at her screen. He looked at his thermos. She looked at her screen again. 37 seconds. Vora had never seen the scanner take more than 2 seconds, not once in 11 years. At 47 seconds, the screen changed. It did not show a clearance code. It showed something she had never seen in her entire career. A wall of red. Not one flag. Not two. The scanner was producing Biological classification alerts in a rolling cascade, one after another, each one stamped with a priority level she had only ever read about in station emergency manuals. The symbols at the top of the readout were ones she recognized from her basic training, ancient classification codes that predated the modern conclave by thousands of years, and then every alarm on the station went off at once. Sound hit like a physical thing. Every siren, every emergency klaxon, every automated warning system that Vera 9 possessed activated simultaneously. The lights in Gate 11's concourse shifted from their standard warm white to deep red. The floor beneath Vora's feet hummed as blast doors began dropping into place. Across the terminal, somewhere above, she could hear the mechanical grind of security drones launching from their docking brackets, a voice cold, automated in 17 different languages, filled the air. All non-essential personnel are ordered to evacuate Wing C immediately. This is not a drill, please. Move to the nearest safe corridor and await further instruction. Concourse erupted, hundreds of passengers scattered. Thesic families grabbed their children. A group of Velhari traders pressed themselves against the far wall, looking around for the source of the threat. 2 Crethily workers dropped their cargo containers and ran. Station security personnel in full armor began moving through the crowd, weapons drawn, eyes scanning, and in the middle of all of it stood Calderin. He lowered his thermos slowly. He looked at the blast doors coming down. He looked at the drones circling overhead. He looked at the security team now forming a perimeter around Gate 11. He looked at Vora, who was staring at her screen with an expression that sat somewhere between professional terror and pure confusion. He did not run. He did not raise his hands. He did not do anything dramatic. He let out a long, slow breath through his nose, the kind a person makes when they have just realized their day has taken a turn they didn't plan for. Then he set his canvas bag gently on the floor, put his thermos on top of it, and sat down on the edge of the gate counter because there was no chair nearby, and his feet had been hurting since the connecting shuttle. Vora finally looked up at him. He looked back at her. "Is this," he said, "because of me?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the screen again. The alerts were still coming. The numbers at the top of the readout were still climbing. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should not move." "I wasn't planning to," he said. Her colleague, a young Velhari male named Sito, who had only been working the gate for 3 months, leaned over her shoulder and looked at the screen. His clear's throat face went through several expressions very quickly, none of them good. "Vora," he said, voice low. "I see it," she said. "What species classification is he under?" She looked at the top line of the readout where the scanner had finally produced its result. After 47 agonizing seconds, she read the number. She read it again because the first time didn't seem real. 47, she said. Sito stared at her. "That's not possible. No living species has more than 47, she repeated. They both looked at the human sitting on the edge of the counter. He had picked his thermos back up. He was drinking from it again, looking at the ceiling with the calm expression of someone who had learned a long time ago that being patient was usually the only sensible option when things went sideways. Outside Gate 11, the station continued to empty. Boots hammered the floor. Distant alarms wailed. Calderon sat and waited and drank his coffee. The analysis chamber was 3 levels below. The main concourse deep in the administrative core of Viera 9, where the walls were thick and the air always smelled faintly of recycled coolant. It was not a room most people ever saw. It held the station's primary biological analysis terminal, a machine the size of a small house built into the wall behind a long row of monitoring desks. It had processed millions of samples in its operational life and had never once produced an error. It was not producing an error now. Dr. Etha soon stood in front of the main display and read the results for the 4th time. She was Velhari, nearly 2 m tall with pale gray skin, long fingers built for precise work, and eyes that were a deep, steady amber. She was 60 years old in Velhari, years which made her roughly the equivalent of a human in their early 40s. She had spent her entire career in xenobiology and had published more research papers on alien genetics than most of her colleagues had read. She was not a person who was easily confused. She was very confused. Run it again, she said. The technician at the terminal gave her a look. Doctor, this is the 4th. Run it again. He ran it again. The results came back identical. Every flag, every marker, every ancient classification code sitting at the top of the report like something dug out of a very old and very serious grave. Asun pulled up a secondary screen and began cross-referencing. She started with the basics. The scanner had flagged the sample under 47 different species classifications, which was physically impossible under normal circumstances. A being could only belong to one species. That was how biology worked. That was how it had always worked across every known form of carbon-based life in the galaxy, except apparently for this. She worked through the flags one by one. The first group she recognized immediately: standard markers for high-endurance biological structure, elevated cellular repair rates, dense bone composition, cardiovascular efficiency, operating well above the conclave average. These were unusual for what the registry listed as a low-technology emerging species, but they were not what had triggered the alarms. The second group was more serious. The human samples showed immune markers that the conclave's medical database classified as adaptive, meaning the immune system didn't simply fight known pathogens. It learned new ones in real time and built responses to them during the infection itself. This was not supposed to be possible in a species at humanity's stage of development. It typically appeared only in organisms that had spent millions of years being exposed to extreme biological diversity. It was the kind of immune system you found in creatures that had survived things most species hadn't. The third group made her stop. Buried deep in the genetic readout were a set of neurochemical regulators, specific chemical systems in the brain that governed aggression, fear response, and the threshold between rational decision-making and pure survival instinct. Every known sapient species had these in some form. They were part of what made a species civilized. They were the biological brakes on behavior. In this sample, those regulators were present but flagged with a secondary marker she had only ever seen in textbooks. The label read conditional suppression capable, threat activated, which meant in plain language that under sufficient Pressure they could simply switch off. Su-Wen set down her data pad and looked at the wall for a moment. She picked it back up and moved to the oldest part of the report. The flags at the very top, the ones that had been stamped with ancient conclave classification codes, these were what had triggered the station-wide alarm. Not the immune system, not the neurology. These she pulled up the code index and found the original entries. They were older than she had expected. The timestamp on the original classification placed it approximately 60,000 years in the past, which put it before the founding of the modern conclave, before the current charter, before most of the spacefaring civilizations now sitting on the Conclave Council had even developed faster than light travel. Somebody had looked at this species 60,000 years ago and written a report. She read the original entry slowly. It described a planet, small, dense atmosphere, third position from a yellow star, sitting at the edge of what was now the outer territories. The species observed on it were described as early-stage biological entities, not yet developed, not yet aware of space travel or interstellar civilization, but the team that had filed the report had been thorough enough to collect genetic samples, and what they found in those samples had been enough for them to plant a flag, write a warning, and leave. The warning was still in the database. It had been sitting there for 60,000 years, buried under layers of newer data waiting. It read in the old conclave script, Class Omega biological anomaly. Approach with caution. Do not initiate contact without full council review. Return observation classified as high risk. Below that, in what appeared to be a personal note from the lead scientist of that ancient survey team, were 6 words that had no official classification attached to them. We decided it was better to leave soon. Read those 6 words 3 times, then she pulled up the final section of the current report, the part her terminal had flagged in a color because it didn't know how to categorize it cleanly. It concerned 3 specific genetic markers found in the sample that did not match any living species in the known galaxy. The scanner had gone looking for matches and come up empty on modern records, so it had done what it was built to do and searched the historical archives. It found matches there. The 3 markers corresponded to a species referenced in the conclave's oldest records, not in the scientific database, in the historical and mythological archive, the section that cataloged things ancient civilizations had believed or feared or written about before real science existed. The species was named in those records as the Urshaki. They appeared in the origin stories of 11 different spacefaring civilizations, always in the same role, the thing that came before, the reason the ancestors left. Su-Wen sat down in a chair because her legs had decided they were done standing for the moment. She looked at the full report spread across her screens: the immune system, the neurology, the ancient warning, the mythological markers, the 60,000-year-old note from a scientist who had looked at this species in its earliest form and quietly decided not to stick around, and upstairs sitting on a gate counter drinking from a metal thermos was one of them. She pulled up the live security feed from gate 11. The human was still there. He had apparently asked one of the security officers for a second chair because there were now 2 chairs in the frame, and he had his feet up on one of them. He appeared to be looking at the Ceiling, Suwon pressed the comm button. On her desk, General Hiro, she said. The general's voice came back. Immediately, tight and clipped. Report, the scan results are confirmed, she said. There was no error, a pause. How bad? Suwon looked at the screens. She looked at the ancient warning. She looked at the 6 quiet words scientists had written 60,000 years ago and never expected anyone to read. I'll send you the file, she said. But General, the alarm didn't go off. Because something went wrong with the scanner. Then why did it go off? Because something went right, she said. It found exactly what it was looking for. Someone put that warning in the database a very long time ago. They wanted us to know if we ever ran into this species again. Another pause. Longer this time, and he said, and I think, Suwon said carefully, that we should be very polite to the man. Upstairs, they gave him a room. It was a good room as holding rooms went. It had a real chair, a table, a cot against one wall, and a small dispenser in the corner that produced hot drinks. When asked, Calder had tested the dispenser immediately upon arrival and confirmed that it could produce something close enough to coffee that he was willing to accept it. He asked for a second cup while the security officer who had walked him in was still standing. In the doorway, the officer had looked at him for a long moment, then left without saying anything. That had been 2 hours ago. Since then, 3 different people had come to talk to him. The first was a psychologist. She introduced herself as Counselor Petrick, a small, round-faced being from a species Calder didn't recognize, with large dark eyes and a very careful way of holding her hands in her lap. She had a data pad. She set it face down on the table and said she just wanted to talk. No pressure, completely informal. Calder said that was fine. She started gently. How was he feeling? Was he comfortable? Did he understand why he had been asked to wait? He said he felt fine. He was comfortable enough. And he had figured there was some kind of problem with his scan, but he didn't know the details yet. He said it in the same tone a person might use when describing a minor travel delay. Petrick made a small note on her pad. She asked him about stress. How did he manage difficult situations? Was he a person who became angry easily? Calder thought about this seriously, which seemed to surprise her. He said he used to have a shorter fuse when he was younger, but that he had worked on it over the years. He said getting older helped. He said gardening also helped, which got him a long pause. And another small note. She asked about his life, his history, what he had done before he retired. He told her about the service, 30 years of it, most of it in places he couldn't name and doing things he also couldn't fully name, but the broad version was that he had been a soldier in a series of conflicts that humanity had been involved in during its early expansion into nearby space. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a person talks about a job they had done for a long time and were now done with. She asked how many conflicts. He counted on his fingers, 3 major ones, several minor ones that didn't have official names, but that people who had been there remembered clearly. He paused and added a 4th major one that he sometimes forgot to count because it had started as a minor one and escalated. Petrick's pen had gone very still. He asked her if she wanted more detail. She said no, thank you, and ended the session shortly. After, the second visitor was a military assessor named Commander Dresch, a broad, armored Cathali male who came in with the energy of someone who had been told to be calm and was working very hard at it. He sat down across from Calder with a pad of his own and said he had a few standard questions about physical capability. Calder said that was fine. 2. Dresch asked about his physical condition, current fitness level, reaction time, medical history. Calder said he was in reasonable shape for his age, that his knees weren't what they used to be, and that his reaction time was probably slower now than it had been at 30. He said this without embarrassment. Dresch asked about injuries sustained during service. Calder listed them in order from memory. A broken left arm in year 4, shrapnel to the right side of his torso in year 9, which had required 2 surgeries. A severe burn on his left forearm in year 14. He pushed his sleeve up briefly to show the scar, then pulled it back down. A broken leg in year 22. 3. Separate exposure events to chemical or biological agents in the field, depending on how you classified one of them. Dresch's expression had become very difficult to read. Calder added, because it seemed relevant that he had recovered from all of them. The chemical exposures included his unit had taken weeks to get back on their feet after the second one. He had been functional in 8 days, which the medics at the time had said was unusual, but hadn't been able to explain. He mentioned briefly that after the broken leg, year 22, he had set the bone himself in the field using a piece of equipment that was not meant for that purpose, then walked 11 km to the extraction point because the alternative was not walking at all. He said this the way a person mentions something they did once that was inconvenient at the time. Commander Dresch ended the session. The third visitor was a diplomat. She was Velhari, young and careful, and she asked very calm questions about where he was going and why and what his connection to the conclave was. Calder told her he was traveling to Habitat Station Oran 7 to visit his daughter Myra, who worked there as a nurse. He had not seen her in almost a year because she was very busy, and he respected that, but she had a week off coming up, and she had invited him. He showed her when she asked the message from his daughter on his personal comm. It was 3 lines long and ended with a reminder to bring the tea she liked, because they didn't carry it on the Habitat. The diplomat smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes, thanked him and left, alone again. Calder refilled his coffee and thought about the conversations. He was not a stupid man. He knew something serious was happening. People didn't evacuate entire wings of stations and put you in a holding room because of a routine scan error. Something in his biology had upset someone very much, and he was starting to get a sense of how large the circle of upset people was based on how senior each visitor had been. He was on his 3rd cup when the door opened again. This time it was not a psychologist or an assessor or a diplomat. The man who walked in wore general's insignia across his chest and had the face of someone who had made large and serious decisions for a very long time. He was Cathali, dark-scaled, broad-shouldered, with eyes that were the pale gold color of old coins. He moved like a person who was accustomed to being the most important presence in any room he entered. He sat down across from Calder. He did not offer his name. He placed a data pad flat on the table between them, face up, and turned it so that Calder could read the screen. Calder looked at it. It was the scan. Report, he couldn't read every line of it. Some of it was in script he didn't recognize, but enough of it was in standard galactic text that he could get. The shape of things, biological flags, classification markers, what appeared to be a very old warning. Notice, time stamped in a way that suggested it was older than most current civilizations. Read all the way down, he looked at it. For a long time, the general watched him look at it. Then the general asked in a voice that was steady and deliberate and just slightly too controlled. Do you know what you are? Calder looked up from the screen. He looked at the general's face. He looked back at the data pad once more, then set it down gently and picked up his coffee. He took a slow sip. I'm guessing, he said, that this is going to make me miss my connecting shuttle. The council chamber was at the very top of Vera 9's administrative tower, a wide, circular room with a high ceiling and a floor made of dark polished stone that reflected the light in a way that made the whole space feel larger and more serious than it already was. Around curved central table sat representatives of 31 different species. Some sat in standard chairs. Some had special seats designed for their anatomy. One species, the gas-breathing Orvathi, attended a sealed mobile container that moved quietly along the far wall. Calder was brought in and placed at a single seat at the open end of the table, facing all of them. There was no second chair. He noticed this. He sat down anyway, put his hands on the table and looked around at the faces, or the things that served as faces, watching him. Some of them radiated obvious hostility. Some looked cautious. A few showed something that might have been curiosity if it had been wearing different clothes. The session was called to order by a tall Vilhari elder at the head of the table, who introduced himself as High Coordinator Vile and explained in careful language that this was an emergency classification review. Calder's biological profile had triggered a mandatory reclassification of humanity under conclave protocols. The council was here to decide what category that reclassification should produce. Calder asked if he was allowed to speak. Vile said he would be invited to speak at the appropriate time. The appropriate time was apparently not now. The debate started without him. The first representative to stand was a Thurak, a species Calder vaguely recognized from his time in the outer stations, quadrupedal with dark plated skin and a voice that came out as a series of deep harmonic tones that the translator in his ear reduced to words. The Thurak delegate said plainly and without apology that the scan results constituted a security threat of the highest order and that humanity's settled world should be placed under observation quarantine immediately. He used the phrase biologically unpredictable several times. He used the phrase historically dangerous once, then appeared to decide he had said enough and sat back down. A Vilhari delegate from the Scientific Council spoke next, more carefully but not much more kindly. She said the data was clear. A species with this kind of biological profile, the immune adaptability, the neurological threshold markers, the sheer breadth of classification flags, represented an unknown variable that the conclave had no existing framework for. She recommended a full research moratorium, no further human transit through conclave space until a complete Biological study had been conducted. Nobody asked how long that would take. Calder got the impression the answer was a long time and that this was somewhat the point. He sat quietly and listened. This was something he had learned in 30 years of service, that the most useful thing a person could often do in a room where decisions were being made was to listen to who said what and how they said it before speaking a single word themselves. A smaller delegate toward the far end of the table stood up. Delegate was crethily insectoid with 4 arms folded across a narrow chest and large compound eyes that caught the light strangely. The crethily had been trading with human colony worlds for nearly 2 decades. Calder knew this. He had met crethily traders a handful of times in his life and found them straightforward and practical, which were qualities he respected. This delegate's name was Senior Voice Tika, and she spoke differently from the others. She did not talk about classification flags or biological threat assessments. She talked about a medical station on a colony world called Harith 3, 11 years ago, where a Kreth cargo vessel had been docked during a plague outbreak. Every other species crew had evacuated. The human staff of the station had stayed. She said they had stayed not because they were ordered to, and not because they were unaware of the risk. They stayed because there were sick people and they were doctors and nurses, and that was what they did. 3 of them contracted the illness. All 3 recovered. She said the Krev aboard that vessel remembered those 3 people and always would. She talked about a human engineer named Sostfeld who had spent 9 hours in a vacuum-rated suit repairing the life support on a Kreth freighter that everyone else had already abandoned as unsalvageable because Sostfeld had decided it wasn't unsalvageable and wasn't willing to let the remaining crew die to prove someone else's assessment right. She said Sostfeld had fixed it. She said he had then accepted a cup of terrible Kreth tea and called it even. She said that in her experience, humans were not a threat, they were a problem, she said, but the problem was that they were very hard to discourage. Once they had decided something needed doing, the chamber was not moved the way Calder had hoped it might be. The Thurak delegate said that personal anecdotes about individual humans did not change a genetic report. The Velhari scientific delegate agreed. The debate returned to classification categories and security protocols and words that sounded very reasonable and led toward conclusions that were not. Calder looked at his hands on the table. Then Dr. Soon entered the chamber. She walked in quietly through the side door and went directly to the High Coordinator, leaning down to speak to him in a low voice. Vale listened. His expression shifted in a way that was small but noticeable to anyone paying attention, and Calder was paying attention. The High Coordinator straightened up and called for silence. He said Dr. Soon had a final finding from the biological analysis that had not been included in the initial report. He said the council should hear it soon. Took the floor. She stood at the center of the room and spoke clearly, without drama, which somehow made it worse. She explained the 3 genetic markers in Calder's DNA that matched no living species. She explained that the scanner had gone to the historical archive to find a match. She explained what it had found there, a species named in the oldest records of 11 different civilizations, always as the same thing. The reason the ancestors left, she showed them the records, not all of Them, just the consistent shape of it. 11 different cultures, 11 different origin stories, all of them describing a period when their earliest spacefaring ancestors had departed from a region of space that corresponded in current stellar mapping to Earth's solar system, all of them describing a creature that had not been like them. Something older, something that did not stop. The chamber was very quiet. One of the delegates said, "Are you telling us that the HFY are real?" "I am telling you," Soon said, "that the genetic evidence suggests they were. The HFY are a myth. 60,000 years ago," Soon said, "someone put a real warning in a real database about a real species on a real planet. That warning just went off. Nobody spoke for a moment." Calder raised his hand. It was such a simple, quiet gesture that it took a second for people to notice it. But they did notice. One by one, the representatives looked at him. 31 species in one room, and every pair of eyes or eye equivalents turned toward the single human sitting at the open end of the table with one hand raised like a student in a classroom. He waited until he was sure he had their attention. "I have a question," he said. His voice was calm. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. "This HFY species you're describing." He paused. "You said they went extinct." Vale looked at him. "That is what the historical record suggests. Yes, they are not present in any current." "You're sure about that?" Calder said. The room was silent, not the polite silence of people listening. The other kind. The kind that happens when something has just shifted and everyone in the room felt it at the same time, but hasn't caught up to what it means yet. Calder put his hand back on the table. He looked at the screen behind Soon, where the old records were still displayed. The migration stories, the departure accounts, 11 civilizations, all running in the same direction from the same place at roughly the same time. He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked back at the council. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The question was already sitting in the middle of the room, and everyone in that chamber was now doing the same math, and the answer was the same for all of them. If the HFY hadn't gone extinct, then they hadn't gone anywhere. They had just been left behind, and in 60,000 years being left behind on a difficult planet with no help and no technology and no knowledge of what they once were. They had done what the genetic record said they were built to do. They had survived, they had grown, and now one of them was sitting in this room asking politely if he was going to miss his shuttle. Nobody moved for a long time. The question Calder had left in the middle of the room sat there like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples kept going. He could see it in the faces around the table, the moment of realization arriving at different speeds. For different people, some faster, some slower, but all landing in the same place. Eventually, High Coordinator Vale was the first to recover. He was old and had spent his career learning to keep his face neutral in rooms like this, and he managed it now, though just barely. He looked at Calder and said in a voice that was very controlled that the council would appreciate anything the human wished to say. The floor apparently was his. Calder looked around the room one more time. 31 species, most of them afraid, some of them angry, all of them watching him the way you watch something you weren't sure about yet ready to step Back if necessary, not quite ready to step forward. He understood that. He had seen that look before, usually in places with worse lighting and worse stakes. He took a breath and started talking. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He just talked. The way he had talked to the psychologist and the assessor and the diplomat earlier in the day, plainly, without decoration, as if the only goal was to say the thing that was true and let it sit there on its own merits. He talked about human history, not the version that got put on plaques or in school materials, the real version, the long one, the one with all the difficult parts left in. He talked about wars that had burned cities and ended civilizations, plagues that had killed third of entire populations, sometimes more, famines, collapses, disasters, both natural and created by human hands. He did not list them like achievements. He listed them the way a doctor reads a patient's chart. This happened and then this happened and then this. He talked about how many times human civilization had come close to ending. Several of the delegates shifted in their seats. He talked about what happened every time it came close to ending, how the survivors had looked at the rubble and picked up whatever was still usable and started again. Not because they had a plan, not because they were confident it would work, but because the alternative, sitting down and accepting that it was over, did not seem to be something humans were biologically capable of choosing for very long before. Something in them pushed back against it and said no. He said he didn't think this made humans special. He said he thought it just made them stubborn in a particular direction. He talked about the expansions into space, the early ones, which had been slow and expensive and had caused lives and resources in quantities that most rational observers would have said were too high to justify continuing. The fact that continuing had happened anyway, the colony failure, stations that had depressurized, ships that had been lost, settlements that had found conditions too hostile to maintain. He talked about how many times human beings had gone back to those same hostile conditions after a failure, with slightly better equipment and slightly more information, and tried again. He talked about the Credley Plague Station because senior voice Tika had mentioned it, and it was a good example of the thing he was trying to describe, not because the humans who had stayed were brave in some grand cinematic way, but because when they had looked at the situation, there are sick people there, is risk, we could leave. They had done the calculation differently than you might expect. The risk had been real. The choice to stay had been real. It had not felt to the people making it like heroism. It had felt like the obvious thing to do given the circumstances. He said that was the part that was hard to explain. Humans did not stay in difficult places because they were unaware of the difficulty. They stayed because awareness of the difficulty was not usually enough on its own to make them leave. The Thurak delegate said carefully that this was exactly what made them dangerous. Calder looked at him. Maybe, he said, or maybe it depends on what direction that stubbornness is pointed. He leaned forward slightly. He said the conclave was afraid that humans would be a problem. He understood that, looking at the genetic report, looking at the history, looking at the ancient warning left 60,000 years ago by people who had looked at early humanity and decided to go somewhere else. The fear made sense. It had logic to it, but he asked them to Look at what humans had actually done. With 60,000 years, they had not built an empire. They had not spread across the galaxy, burning everything behind them. They had not even known the galaxy was full of other people until very recently. They had spent 60,000 years on one planet and a handful of nearby systems fighting each other and making up and fighting again, building things and knocking them down and building them again, taller, getting sick and healing, failing and trying a different way. They had spent 60,000 years becoming something he did not know, he said. What the HFY had been like before the Great Departure. He had read nothing about them before. Today, he did not know if they had been cruel or kind or somewhere in between. He could not speak for whatever his distant ancestors had been 60,000 years ago any more than any person in this room could speak for what their ancestors had been. He could only speak for what humans were now, and what they were now was a species that wanted, more than anything, what most species wanted: safety enough to eat, work that meant something, people they loved nearby, something interesting to look at on the other side of the next hill. He said humans were not going to stop. That was true. He would not pretend otherwise. They would keep pushing outward, keep building stations and ships and routes through space, keep showing up in places the conclave might prefer they didn't, keep staying when things got hard, keep trying again after failures. That was going to happen regardless of what this room decided today, but they would do those things the way they had always done them, not as conquerors, as the endlessly, sometimes infuriatingly persistent creatures. They had always been looking for the next horizon, trying to fix the broken thing in front of them, arguing with each other about the best way to do it, and refusing, as a matter of deep biological principle, to simply give up and go home. He picked up his thermos from the table where it had been sitting. This whole time, he looked at it for a second, then he looked at the room. The alarm went off, he said quietly, because your machine recognized something it hadn't seen in 60,000 years, something that survives everything. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his knees have a lot of miles on them. You wanted to know if that should scare you. He tucked his thermos under his arm. That depends entirely on whether you plan to be in the way. He walked to the door. No one stopped him. The security officer outside looked at the general, who had been standing against the wall this whole time, watching. The general looked at Calder. He said nothing. He made a small gesture with one hand. The security officer stepped aside. Vote happened 2 hours later. It was not unanimous. The etheric bloc voted against, 2 others abstained, but the count was clear. And when the high coordinator read the result into the official record of Vera 9's emergency session, he read it in the slow, deliberate voice of a man who understood that he was saying something that would matter for a very long time. Humanity was reclassified, not as Category 3 emerging species, not as a quarantine risk or a security concern or a biological anomaly requiring observation. Category Omega independent civilization, first contact status equals not subjects. Senior voice Tika was the first to cast the vote in favor. She did it without hesitation, folding 2 of her forearms across her chest in the credly gesture of settled conviction, the one that meant this is Decided, and I am not interested in revisiting it. Calder missed his shuttle by 4 hours. His daughter Myra sent him a message that was mostly disbelief and some words he was fairly sure she had learned from the other nurses on the habitat. He sent back a brief reply explaining that there had been a small situation at the border transit and that he would explain when he arrived. He added that he was bringing the tea. She sent back a single word, fine. He smiled at that. In the archive of Conclave Station Vera 9, in the oldest section of the Biological Registry database, the entry that had sat untouched for 60,000 years was updated that evening by Dr. Athasoon, who felt that someone should do it and that it might as well be her. She deleted the original warning notice. She kept the old timestamp because it was part of the record, and records should be honest. In the space where the warning had been, she typed a new entry. She kept it short: status still alive. First contact initiated. Proceed with respect. She looked at it for a moment. Then she added one more line below the official text in small letters that were not part of the formal record, but that she thought should be there anyway for anyone who found it later and wanted to understand. They came back on their own. It took them 60,000 years. They walked the whole way. She saved the file, turned off her terminal, and went to find something to eat outside the station's wide observation windows. The stars were exactly where they had always been, patient, distant, and full of the kind of silence that waits to be filled. It wouldn't be waiting much longer.